The clutch is placed between the engine and manual transmission or manual transaxle on nearly every car. The flywheel is bolted to the engine crankshaft and the clutch housing is bolted to the flywheel. The main parts of the clutch system are the flywheel, the clutch shaft, the clutch disc, the pressure plate assembly, the release bearing, and the clutch linkage. The flywheel is bolted to the engine crankshaft. The flywheel acts as a vibration damper to smooth out the irregular vibrations caused by the ignition cycles in the engine. The flywheel also adds inertia to the rotating crankshaft and provides a smooth machine surface for the clutch disc to contact. The flywheel is the friction surface for one side of the clutch disc and serves to dissipate the heat developed from the friction of engagement. The clutch cover, or pressure plate, is bolted to the flywheel. In the center of the flywheel is the bore for the pilot bearing, or bushing, that carries the spline clutch shaft. A ring gear is pressed onto the outer circumference of the flywheel. The ring gear meshes with the starter drive to spin the engine during startup. Automatic transmission vehicles use a flex plate with integral gear teeth instead of a flywheel. The input shaft, or clutch shaft, projects from the front of the transmission. The clutch disc rides on the splines of the input shaft. A smaller protrusion at the end of the shaft mates into the pilot bearing to carry the load of the shaft. Most transaxles do not use a pilot bearing or bushing because the input shaft is shorter and carries less of a load. The clutch disc is a steel plate covered with a friction material. The clutch disc is fitted between the flywheel on one side and the pressure plate on the other. The clutch disc has torsional coil springs around the center to dampen vibration during engagement. When engaged, the flywheel, clutch disc, and pressure plate form a mechanical coupling of the engine to the transmission or transaxle to transmit the torque and speed of the engine to the transmission input shaft. The pressure plate squeezes the clutch disc onto the flywheel when the clutch is engaged and pulls away from the disc when the clutch is disengaged. The pressure plate is basically a large spring-loaded clamp that rotates with the flywheel. On the clutch side is a machine surface that contacts the clutch. Between the machine surface and the clutch cover is, in most cases, a single diaphragm spring that supplies the pressure to hold the clutch against the flywheel. The spring includes fingers for the release bearing to ride on. When the clutch pedal is depressed, the fingers are pushed forward by the release bearing. The effect is similar to pushing in on the top of an oil can. The pressure on the outside of the plate is relieved, and the pressure plate retracts from the clutch disc, allowing it to disengage. The release bearing, often called a throwout bearing, is a ball-type bearing that is located in the bell housing and is operated by the clutch linkage. When the clutch pedal is depressed, the release bearing is thrust towards the flywheel to press in on the pressure plate fingers. The pressure on the diaphragm fingers causes the clutch disc to release. The release bearing slides on a hollow hub that is part of the transmission's front bearing retainer. The input shaft runs through the bearing sleeve. Most release bearings are constant running release bearings, meaning that they rest lightly on the fingers of the pressure plate when the clutch is engaged.